Hello, welcome back to Stories of Resistance. Today we're going to look at the story of the Hebrew midwives from Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 22. And the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. The name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said to them, Why have you done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. They are lively, and they are delivered before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Here we see common methods of oppression, methods that have been used for a long time, going all the way back to the time that Israel was in Egypt, and going down even to our own day. Population control was the name of the game. The oppressors wanted to rid the world of the most capable of resistance, those who were most likely to resist, the males, and the resistance to this edict comes from an unlikely source. Hebrew midwives. It could have been any number of people who resisted, but these two midwives, both Shiphrah and Puah, are named specifically as fearing God. It's hard for us to estimate the degree of integration, even religious integration, that the Israelites had with Egypt. Joshua tells us about this in Joshua chapter 24. He says that when they were in Egypt, they worshipped false gods. This gives further explanation to the oppression they faced. Whenever God's people begin worshiping the false gods, God gives them over to the oppression of those who rule under the name of the false gods. The dragon devours children. He always has. We see it first here, and then we see it later in the worship of Moloch. Both the idolatrous nations and Israel themselves at times would give their children to the worship of Moloch. It said that they would cause them to pass through the fire. The dragon was still devouring the children. We see it with Herod when he kills the males in Bethlehem. The dragon still today attempts to kill children. But in the United States and other Western developed countries, it doesn't take government coercion like it used to in China and other places in the East. We voluntarily kill our children. We have the lure of making a better life for ourselves, of not having to give. We're told if you have children, they're going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you can't afford that. Most people should protect the environment and preserve it from having more kids, and consequently, we have one of the lowest birth rates in our history. This is the strategy of the dragon. We should not neglect what he has done and what he is doing now. But there was a faithful group, a two-woman remnant in the Hebrew territory who refused to kill the baby boys. When they refused to kill them, they were actually called before Pharaoh for it. You ever thought about the first faithful Israelite to testify in the presence of Pharaoh was not Moses. It was Shiphrah and Puah. They resisted this murderous dictate, and they resisted for one reason that we're specifically told: they feared God. Their reason to Pharaoh, while deceptive, was also wise. They said the Hebrew women are more lively, they're more vigorous. That is, they're able to give birth without the aid of midwifery. It's similar to a situation I know of in our time when a couple, married parents, wanted to use a midwife in a state where midwifery was illegal. So when the baby was born at home, in the presence of a midwife, a few days later, a social services official came to the house to investigate what happened and interview the parents. And the parents' response was that the father delivered the baby, which he had. There was a midwife there coaching, but she did not actually deliver the baby. So for these Hebrew midwives, the answer was technically correct. That's the type of answer that they gave. And I'm not arguing that it's not deceptive. I am saying it was wise. In the end, God blessed the resistance of these courageous ladies. He gave them a household. He gave the midwives a household. That is, He gave them children. And let's not neglect the names of these ladies. They have a very interesting meaning that communicates something about the general story for the rest of Exodus. We see this story in Exodus 1, the very beginning of the book. Of the Exodus itself, we know that it's the story of them leaving, God's people leaving Egypt. The name of the first midwife, Shiphrah, means dawn, as in the beginning of the day, and Puah means lovely or fragrant. These two ladies, in their faithful stand against the oppressive requirements of Pharaoh, marked the dawn, the arrival of the spring or the rebirth of God's people. It may not seem like a major significant stand, but God used them to speak boldly and to speak wisely in the presence of the physical representative of the supreme God of Egypt, with a little g, the little g God of Egypt, that is, the Pharaoh. So how do we apply this lesson? First of all, you never know how small acts of faithful resistance will eventually lead to significant works. It is the work of these women that will lead eventually to the birth of Moses. We know God protected Moses throughout his life, but the midwives didn't know how their work would impact all of Hebrew history. They obeyed simply in their own sphere, in not killing the male children. Their work is the birth, the dawn of the resistance and eventual redemption of God's people. So you never know how the small things you do that are faithful to God in your area lead to greater works in the future. Don't despise the day of small things. Second, when you fear God above men and stand firm, He often protects and blesses you. We see that with them, He blessed these midwives with a household. So the implication in their work is that they probably could not have children up to that point. But God gave them children because they feared Him and they obeyed faithfully in the face of opposition. Lastly, our resistance should be prepared and wise. The midwives didn't overtly stand and say, "We're not going to follow these rules. We refuse." No. They had a story, and they wisely used that story that the Hebrew women just gave birth before they could arrive to help. And again, it was deceptive, but it also very likely had some truth to it. It was a clever, a wise answer, and God blessed their wisdom. Resistance doesn't have to be loud and brash. Throughout history, we see that often the best resistance is practiced by those who do so quietly and without trying to draw a lot of attention to themselves. So, be wise in the way that you resist. Certainly don't give in to evil, as they didn't, but think of what is the best way for you to resist the evil. Well, that's all for now, and I look forward to seeing you next time.